So thank you, everybody, for joining us. Thank you for braving the elements this morning, which I found to be a little disappointing at the end of the day, given all the hype. Pretty easy commute in, I hope, for everybody. But what we're doing today, I'm Ilan Goldenberg. I run the Middle East program here at the Center for New American Security. And what we're going to be doing today is releasing a new report, A Realistic Path for Progress on Iran. Which, not the most creative title, but I think is sort of where we are. And this is the point of the report, to be as pragmatic as possible given the current situation. So just to give you a little context on the report and how we conceived of it, everybody up on this stage and really all the authors of the report, I think, share a couple of common features. One is they actually all supported staying inside the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which is, frankly, a position that's relatively unified across most experts here in Washington, even if on the political side there's more debate and controversy about that problem. But I would even argue that by last May, when the president decided to walk away, you even had most Republicans at that point, even many who had opposed the agreement, saying, well, walking away might be worse than just sticking and staying in, given where we are. But this is where we are. So the point of this report and this effort was not to say, well, we should just walk back into the JCPOA, since that's not happening, certainly not for the next couple of years. Instead, it was to say, okay, given the reality of where we are and given what the administration is trying to do, which it's expressed as trying to change Iran's calculus in order to come back into a new agreement of some sort and a new negotiation to address outstanding issues, or, as some would argue, it's to look for regime change. It's unclear precisely what the administration's position is, but that seems to be more of where they're going. The former is at least the stated position. Given that that's the position and the approach, what can we do? What kind of pragmatic recommendations can we make, and should they be pursuing, given that reality? And so that's really the effort we tried to come up with. We also thought, we talk about 12 guiding principles to achieving U.S. policy goals, which was a bit of a response to Secretary Pompeo's 12 policy objectives that he laid out in his speech last May, and which have largely driven U.S.-Iran policy since then. And I think it's actually the timing for this could not be better, given what we saw yesterday with the country's intelligence chiefs briefing up on the Hill and the release of the annual threat assessments report from the U.S. intelligence community, which basically said, in regards to Iran, that the current policy doesn't seem to be making all that much progress. It didn't explicitly say that, but it said a few things that I thought were noteworthy. One, Iran continues to abide by the JCPOA, but is considering ways to start stretching the limits and finding ways to do things that are a bit outside of the agreement. Two, on the regional front, Iran has, if anything, gotten more aggressive in the last couple of years with its behavior. And three, in terms of domestic politics, there's definitely internal economic challenges. There's definitely schisms and splits within the country. But we're not on the verge of total collapse or regime change or anything like that. Some of those things were explicitly stated. Some of them were implicit as you read through the global threat assessment. That's at least what I took out of it. So, given that context, I think this is a great opportunity to have this discussion today. And what I'd like to do is introduce our panelists. Before I do that, I also want to give a special shout out to two of our colleagues who are not up here, because you can't put 7 people on a panel. But Peter Harrell and Alyssa Catalano-Yours, who were also co-authors on this report and contributed significantly to various pieces of it. So thank you guys for all the help and the work and the partnership on this. Now quickly, I'm not going to do long introductions, but just to say we have Eric Brewer, who previously was at the NSC, actually during the first year of the Trump administration, working working on North Korea and Iran issues. Before that, a long career in the intelligence community, and he's now our International Affairs Fellow here at CNAS. Ariane Tabatabai, who is an associate political scientist at the RAND Corporation. Before that was at Georgetown, the Belfer Center, and other places, and been an expert on Iran and written on both Iran and nonproliferation for years now. Liz Rosenberg, who runs our Economy, Energy, and Security program here at CNAS, and anybody who follows Iran issues here in Washington knows that Liz is the person to go to on any questions having to do with sanctions. I always appreciate how much we able to complement each other and work together on these types of issues. And finally, Nick Heras, who is our fellow here at CNAS in our Middle East Security program, where he focuses on regional questions, most deeply on Syria, but also Yemen, the Levant, and North Africa. So I think with that, I think we should just get rolling with our discussion. And Eric, I'll start with you as somebody who actually spent the first year at the Trump NSC, working on Iran, on nonproliferation, and also on maybe more on North Korea and on the North Korea maximum pressure strategy. So what's your assessment of what the administration's policy is and how it's been going for the past year since the president announced that the United States would be leaving the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action?
Yeah, thanks, Ilan, and it's so fantastic to be here today. I think if you had to put sort of a bumper sticker on it, or sort of a 101 level explanation of the administration's strategy, it's really about sort of maximizing pressure on Iran to such a degree that its leadership decides to return to the negotiating table for sort of a quote-unquote big for big type deal, and change its policies on a range of issues that have been the source of tensions in the U.S.-Iran relationship now for decades. And I think there's a implicit element of that there that's going to be a lot of pressure, right? You're going to have to almost generate regime-threatening type pressure to cause its leadership to make that type of calculation, because these policies are so foundational to the Islamic Republic. So I think that's kind of the bumper sticker level of the strategy. I think the strategy has evolved a lot over time, actually. It's sort of maintained that maximum pressure banner, but the means by which the administration has pursued this has changed, and arguably, I would say, they've undercut themselves somewhat throughout this process. And I would sort of put that evolution into sort of, I guess, there's 1.0, 2.0, and 3.0, and I think kind of now we're in Iran strategy 3.0. The 1.0 was the sort of the gist of that was, stay in the JCPOA, try and fix the flaws of the deal by working with allies, and in exchange for remaining in the deal and working with partners, use that as leverage to get the Europeans to do more on a range of other Iranian threats like missiles and terrorism and the like. Meanwhile, maximizing U.S. economic sanctions in every way possible. That's not an actual violation of the JCPOA. Then that changed when the U.S. decided to withdraw from the JCPOA. And so that part of the strategy was now gone, and the approach was sort of, okay, now we're out of the deal, and now it was kind of more along the lines of, we can reimpose all the sanctions that were waived as part of the nuclear deal, but also it was a little bit more of an approach of especially with Europe, of sort of get on board with the strategy, right, and get on board with the pressure campaign. And then that changed again in what I would call 3.0 when Trump made a decision to announce the withdrawal from Syria. And so you have, throughout that process, what were arguably sources of U.S. leverage, and I would argue could have contributed to the effort to maximize pressure. You had those sort of lessening over time. And I would also argue that throughout that process of the strategy, not only do you have that trend, but you also have a couple of other tensions. And one of those tensions, which you alluded to earlier, which is sort of this idea of the strategy as it is on paper, which is maximum pressure to get a bigger, better deal, but also those who see this sort of as a door, as a gateway to weakening the regime, to ultimate regime change. And even if the pressure strategy fails, that's sort of a second best, or even for some more desirable outcome. And so I think you have that tension a little bit in the strategy. And I think you're going to continue to have that moving forward. The second point I would mention on that is there's also tension between those who see non-proliferation value from remaining in the deal, and those who don't like the deal and would want to kill it, or those who view the deal itself and Iran's participation in that as inhibiting maximum pressure. In other words, you're never going to have true maximum pressure until Iran's out of that deal. And so I think you're still seeing that play out over time. And I think for now, the non-proliferation camp and those who see value in Iran staying in the deal is winning, but I'm not sure that's necessarily going to hold. And so your question, is the strategy working? I think that the answer to that is no. I think the 12 demands that as Pompeo has laid them out, and the sort of the means that the U.S. is pursuing to get that, as you said before, I think we're all on the same page here. We're not going to achieve that using the current means, and likely, arguably, that sort of strategy is going to take decades and decades and decades. But the question is, can we make incremental progress on those objectives, which I think are actually broadly bipartisan? Can we do that within the framework of the administration strategy? And I think the answer to that is yes. And I know we'll talk about that a little bit later.
Sure. So Ari, turning to you, we've seen what the U.S. approach has been, but maybe we could talk about how the Iranians have responded to all this. And I think we've all been, at least I'll tell you, speaking for myself, I've been pretty surprised at how restrained they've been. You and I wrote a piece about how they might react back in May, and I think probably would say that it's been a little better than we might have expected. But what is going on in Tehran now? How are they thinking about the way forward?
Yeah, thanks, Ilan. Thanks for having me. So, the past 8 months or so have been characterized by a lot of tension in Iran as well, kind of similar to what Eric was describing in terms of the administration push and pull for, whether or not we should stay in or whether or not we should continue helping the implementation of the JCPOA. I would say that this debate has manifested itself within the elite, where you've had a lot of pushback by hardliners who have again, sort of noted that, the Iranians haven't received anything from the JCPOA, the sanctions keep coming, the Europeans are not delivering their end of the bargain, and so what's the point of staying in the JCPOA and constraining Iran's nuclear program when they're not getting what they came to the table for? The second thing that is happening is the continued popular protest and discontent, and I think that we have a tendency to kind of stress that a bit too much, and that there are protests going on, there is discontent, but if you pick up any newspaper in the U.S. these days, it seems like the regime is about to collapse tomorrow, and I think the report that came out yesterday that you mentioned sort of lays out that that's not necessarily the case, that yes, there is a lot of discontent, especially when it comes to the economy, but that doesn't mean that the regime collapse is imminent, is going to happen shortly. That said, the pressure and the tensions that have been building up over the past 8 months are now starting to actually produce some results, and we're beginning to see that. So now, as we're entering the sort of end of the, I guess, the third year of the implementation of the JCPOA, I'm increasingly concerned about what the next year is going to hold. Part of what's happening is that right after President Trump announced that he was withdrawing the U.S. from the JCPOA, Khamenei, the Iranian supreme leader, came out and said, look, we're going to sit tight and see what happens next. We want to focus on working with the Europeans to try to see what they can offer Iran. And what he had said in that speech was essentially a policy that has held pretty well until today, and I suspect is going to hold for the foreseeable future, which is that Iran is not going to do anything very obvious in terms of violating the JCPOA, but that it is going to begin to lay out the groundwork for the foundations for a potential EU withdrawal, or for the EU to fail to give Iran what it wants, and so Iran would be able to kind of resume certain activities. We're starting to see this today. As we're speaking, Iran publicized this video, the Iranian media publicized this video of a truck, a huge truck, allegedly moving a bunch of yellow cake from one facility to the other. So for a country that is actually in trouble for having conducted covert nuclear activities and not having declared a lot of what it was doing, this is an unusual kind of message to be sending, but it is a message to the domestic constituents to try to tell them that, the nuclear progress is continuing despite the JCPOA, that the JCPOA didn't mean the end of the nuclear program. It's also a message to the Europeans that if they don't manage to deliver what Iran is hoping for, that Iran does have a number of options. So the developments that I think are important to watch over the next few months are, one, what sort of activities, nuclear activities specifically, Iran engages in. And we laid this out in the report. There are going to be activities that are going to be concerning, perhaps, that we should pay close attention to, that we should coordinate with allies in terms of figuring out what to do with them. But there are also going to be a number of activities that are not going to be violations of the deal, but that are going to certainly test the JCPOA, and they're meant precisely to send a message both domestically and internationally to the EU. The second type of development that I think is important to watch is what's been going on between Iran and the EU. And again, a lot of this has to be taken within the context of domestic politics in Iran. There have been a number of allegations of spying, assassination attempts by Iran's intelligence units on EU soil. And again, part of this is to put pressure on the Europeans to try to show that Iran also has means to coerce the EU if it needs to. Part of it is also to kind of signal to hardliners back home that, just because Iran is dealing with the JCPOA, is continuing the implementation, it doesn't mean that it's sort of sitting on its hands. But it's also important to note that I think part of it is overconfidence by the Iranians, that they have been observing what's been going on between the U.S. and the EU, and they've been reading it as the split that they can now kind of leverage. And I think it's now starting to translate into a bit of an overconfidence, Iran playing its hand a little bit too much, and perhaps actually bringing the EU closer to the U.S. position in a way that I don't think we would have imagined 8 months ago when President Trump announced he was pulling out of the deal.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I share your view on that, especially some of these efforts in Europe and Denmark and France around these stifled terrorist attacks. I think the Iranians are actually quite lucky that none of these were successful. If they had been, I think it would have been catastrophic for their position globally. And really sort of makes you wonder if they're if there's some elements who are purposely trying to do that inside the system. But it's a good transition also, Liz, to what I wanted to ask you. We have the Iranians thus far staying in the agreement, trying to manage the downsides. But the real motivation for staying in the agreement is this calculation that they can separate the U.S. from its partners and get benefits from the rest of the P5+1. How is that going?
Right. Great question. And thanks, by the way, for your kind remarks at the introduction for me at the beginning. It's always a pleasure to have this conversation with all of you and all of you who've come to talk with us about this important issue. Thank you. So how's it going? Top line is so far the mostly symbolic efforts from the rest of the parties to the deal are resulting in adequate success, so that this is holding for now, but there are some risks on the horizon. And Ari was already talking about some of those that we should certainly bear in mind, and there's some other economic ones that I'll point out. But just to go walk through a couple of main points about the efforts that are meant to keep Iran in the deal and how they're going. First, on those efforts. So there's two buckets here: political efforts and some other, what we might call technical or economic efforts. So the political efforts are ones that we know because we watch them in the news. So these are sweeping political gestures, on-the-record comments, including with Iranian officials, repeated commitments to stay within the deal and to work with the parties to preserve this important nuclear non-proliferation agreement and for Iran, and then more broadly for the broader proliferation concerns. And as a technical matter, we see mostly the gestures from Europeans publicly. So this, you'll recall, will include things you've heard of, such as the blocking statute that the EU brought forward and the special purpose vehicle intended to facilitate payments. At first, Mogherini had said, and others, that this was meant to be a true economic lifeline, an ability to providing a platform to sell Iranian oil, not using a U.S. bank and avoiding U.S. jurisdiction and therefore exposure to sanctions. The blocking statute I just mentioned is within the EU, a legal measure designed to support European companies from not complying with and encouraging them not to comply with U.S. sanctions measures and offering some relief or compensation if they do get hit with U.S. sanctions measures. And this is a strong political message with some legal undergirding, at least in the case of the blocking statute, to try and keep European commercial entities from complying with U.S. law. However, I said at the beginning that these were mostly symbolic, which isn't to say that they're not strongly supported initiatives by European political leaders, but as an economic matter, they are pretty much symbolic. They haven't encouraged or provided the legal insurance for European commercial entities not to comply with U.S. sanctions. And in fact, many people have been surprised by how broadly banks and companies all over the world have complied with U.S. unilateral sanctions, even when they have been criticized openly by many other jurisdictions and political leaders. Nevertheless, they have had a powerful economic effect. And that's felt in Iran. Nevertheless, because of the significant reduction exemptions, which are the permissions given by the United States to 8 countries to continue to buy Iranian oil, which provides Iran with an important stream of hard currency, there is a lifeline, an economic channel there, challenging as it may be from a technical perspective to move that money. There's still that economic lifeline for Iran, and that's one of the important reasons why no one is talking about utter economic collapse, and that's not part of the broader equation here. And I don't think we foresee that. It doesn't look as though that's on the horizon. However, there are a couple of indicators that I want to point to in the how is it going camp. It's true that many of the Iranians and other observers of the deal have looked particularly to the European parties to bail out Iran, not just politically in those statements I was mentioning, but also economically. And smart observers, probably some of you all here, and many others have noted that's sort of a strange place to put the emphasis on the economic bailout on the Europeans, because those economic channels have never been as enormous, for example, as some of the trade flows with East Asia, particularly for purchase of Iranian oil and also for supply of plenty of consumer goods. So where's the pressure that Iran should be placing on China to continue to be an important economic lifeline? It hasn't been as discussed, hasn't been as prominent in news and public discussions. And there's reasons for that. Obviously, the political support of Europe is so significant that that's been a primary talking point for Iranians and others. What's changing now, and this is anecdotal, we'd still need to wait a few more months to get more trade data to really call this a powerful trend, but there's more and more anecdotal evidence that there's complaints about China not being more forthcoming in its trade with Iran. So this is different from some years ago when the complaints about Chinese trade was poor quality of the goods and non-preferred consumer goods and other kinds of industrial components that could have been shared with Iran, and lack of Chinese company performance in Iranian oil fields, etc. This is different. This is saying there's not the same volume of trade flowing back to Iran from China. So that's significant when it comes to Iran's remaining lifelines, and it may accelerate some of our expectations about the potential for that inflection moment when Iran feels like the economic dynamics are actually quite difficult, compelling, supporting and strengthening the argument of the regime leaders or elites who are saying, this is not a good deal, we haven't gotten enough out of it, it's really time to rethink the political calculus here. So how is it going? okay at the moment for people interested in watching for sustainability of this deal, but that economic risk, I think, may be accelerating a bit faster than we had previously thought.
So we've been guilty, as we always are, and as a regional guy, I always complain about this, and then I do it when it comes to Iran, is focus so much on the nuclear question that we don't spend as much time on the regional. And indeed, that was part of the justification for why the Trump administration walked out of the JCPOA in the first place. So I want to turn to that, Nick, and ask you, how you see things in Syria and Yemen right now, and specifically, Eric talked about the administration's position and policies thus far, especially on the nuclear agreement and the pressure strategy. But how does what we're doing in Syria right now, the potential withdrawal from Syria, the situation in Yemen, the recent Khashoggi affair, I think, which still has got the fallout, how's all that interplaying with this in terms of U.S. policy towards Iran and where things are going now?
Well, thank you, Ilan, and thank you, everyone, for being here today. I mean, fundamentally, the situation in Syria has gotten worse over the course of the Trump administration. There's now more space that Iran has the ability to access in Syria than it did at the start of the administration. The administration deserved credit for designing a southwest de-escalation zone in southwest Syria on the border of Israel and Jordan that prevented Iran from having access to that space. However, the administration inexplicably over this past summer allowed that de-escalation zone to collapse. And over the intervening months, Iran has worked steadily to build lines of influence and to design local networks that can reinforce its position to apply strategic pressure on Israel. I think fundamentally, when we look at how Iran is trying to operate in Yemen and in Syria, it's to apply strategic pressure on its enemies, to apply strategic pressure on Saudi Arabia via northern Yemen, and to apply strategic pressure on Israel via what I would now call one large zone from Lebanon to western Syria. Iran has expanded its ability to apply that strategic pressure on its foes, and it's not getting better. A dynamic that is very important for us to watch in the wake of President Trump's decision to withdraw U.S. forces from Syria is what will happen in eastern Syria, particularly in what we would call Iraq, or eastern Syria and western Iraq. That space in eastern Syria and western Iraq is important for Iran because it allows Iran to protect Iraq's territorial integrity. And Iraq is very important to Iran in its own sense of national security. I would say that where we stand now is the administration inherited a difficult situation in that Iran had embedded itself very fully in Bashar al-Assad's government, in Bashar al-Assad's security services. The administration has allowed that to get worse. Iran has expanded the military infrastructure it's developed in western Syria to support the Lebanese Hezbollah. It's expanded its network of Hezbollah militias, which include Pakistani, Iraqi, and Afghani fighters, Shia fighters, and it has deployed those fighters in more places in Syria over the course of the Trump administration's position. So it's difficult to see how we can get to a point where we've reduced or diminished Iran from Syria. My own personal assessment is the best you could do, potentially over time, is work with other actors, whether they're other Arab partners or potentially with Russia, to reduce the influence of Iran in Damascus and to reduce the ability for Iran to use Western Syria in particular as a place from which it can continue to support a potential war against Israel, which would have regional shattering consequences. If we turn to Yemen, the challenge in Yemen has always been that Yemen's a much messier and much more complicated conflict than has really been led on. Yemen has many wars, and it's very regional. It's a cliche that Yemen's tribal, but it's regional, tribal, ideological. Where we're most concerned about Iran's influence is, of course, in northern Yemen. And while it's inaccurate to say that the Houthi movement is a proxy of Iran, over the course of the last decade, it has developed greater and greater ideological ties, particularly through the efforts of the IRGC Quds Force. And while it may not be a Hezbollah-like organization yet, it does provide Iran with a permissive space to apply pressure on Saudi Arabia. I mean, the awful truth that you won't hear in D.C. is that Saudi Arabia has lost hundreds of kilometers of its southwest territory. It has daily raids that occur by the Houthis on Saudi territory. The Houthis have the ability to fire missiles into Saudi Arabia, and we've seen that. And that's not going away. And so fundamentally the challenge as we see it in Yemen is how do you reduce the power of the Houthis to the degree where they no longer occupy in Sana'a, but also where the Saudis' own threat assessment has changed. The Khashoggi situation has made it more difficult, has divided our regional partners. It has provided opportunities for Iran to engage with various other regional or broader partners, and it has made the perception of Saudi Arabia much harsher here in the United States. And the awful truth in Yemen is that until you've made the Houthis feel that they cannot militarily hold on to the gains that they've made, I mean, the Houthis essentially, like an ink splot, have spread from their readouts in far northern Yemen southward. Until you've actually reversed those military gains, you're not going to have peace in the southern Arabian Peninsula. But because of the Khashoggi situation, Saudi Arabia's credibility is shot. So the question is there a way that the administration, with its now famous, or in some cases infamous, close ties to the Saudi leadership, can they change Saudi Arabia's threat assessment towards the Houthis, where there's a pragmatic deal that can be made? Is it enough for Saudi Arabia that the Houthis agree to move off the border and to move out of Sana'a, or does there have to be something else? And what I'm fearful of is that as a result of the Khashoggi situation and our dynamics with Saudi Arabia, the Saudis may decide to go with the more maximal decision, which would cause more suffering and more conflict in Yemen. And so both in Yemen and in Syria and in Lebanon, we see Iran is in a strong position, and with doubts over the future position of the United States in the Middle East, it'll be difficult for us to reverse this.
So I think what I'm hearing from the four of you, if I were to summarize it, is the administration's approach over the last year has, things on the nuclear front aren't going great, but are sort of semi-holding together. The administration's not really making all that much progress. And on the regional question, Iran seems to be making more slow, steady progress. I mean, maybe the theme of all of this is slow, steady progress for the Iranians in the region, and keeping the nuclear question at least in the box for now. And so the question is, if that's what's been happening so far, how do we improve it? And that's what we've tried to do with this report. Okay, what kind of steps can we take given this reality? Given that we're not hopping back into the JCPOA tomorrow, what can we do? So Eric, maybe you can tell us what can we do on the nuclear front to keep, to sort of keep or even make the situation better than it is today?
Yeah, so when we tackle this in the report, our recommendations here sort of fall into what I would call three categories, right? So the first one is try and keep Iran in the confines of the deal for now, right? Try and keep these limits on its nuclear activities. And that's sort of in the present, right? That's the reality we live with now, and we want to sustain it. The second recommendation is to plan vigorously and honestly for a scenario where that doesn't happen, right? Where Iran either leaves the deal completely or, as Ari talked about earlier, and as we heard from the intelligence community yesterday, sort of slowly starts to roll back some of these JCPOA commitments. So plan for deterring those activities and plan for a scenario where those sorts of things start to transpire. And the final one is, if things go well, start thinking through what we would really need to do to achieve a new deal or a bigger and better deal, and sort of answer some of these long-term questions, which I would argue would have even remained relevant had we stayed in the JCPOA, which is sort of what type of future Iranian nuclear program are we ultimately prepared to live with? So diving into these a little bit, so the first one, which is, I think we are unabashedly saying that the administration should have its cake and eat it too, right? So you've left the deal, you've achieved that sort of that political objective, and you've satisfied that desire. But now let's try and actually make sure that Iran still adheres to those restrictions and doesn't expand its nuclear program. As much as we all might not like the decision, I think we all see that it's in the U.S. interest and in everyone's interest that these constraints remain. So, I think why do we recommend this? And the simple answer is because if you genuinely do want to make progress on a pressure campaign and get Iran to a place where it's potentially willing to negotiate, you don't need a headache on the nuclear front. You can't deal with a nuclear crisis and try and build that pressure campaign at the same time, or so I think I would argue. And so practically speaking, what does this look like? How do we try and keep Iran within the confines of the deal? And I think a big part of that is sort of not actively targeting or trying to undermine some of the key pillars of the JCPOA. And first and foremost, what comes to mind is not sanctioning the entities that are involved in the JCPOA-blessed cooperation projects that are taking place at redesigning the Arak reactor and redesigning Fordo that are going to make these facilities far less able to contribute to any sort of weapons effort down the road. And so the administration has actually indicated that they're going to waive sanctions on these. We haven't heard a lot about that. So I would actually, I think, it would be helpful for them to come out with some more information about this, but they've indicated a willingness to do that, which I think is a positive development because of the non-proliferation value, that these sorts of projects provide. And the second thing is don't sanction entities that are involved in transferring technology via the procurement channel. This is another thing that if we were to do this, Iran has a good solid case that, again, the deal is not working out as intended because it was promised these things as part of the JCPOA. And, really the transfers that are taking place through the procurement channel anyway, these are not of huge proliferation concern, right? And part of the whole process of vetting those is to make sure they don't have that type of concern. So, in other words, not actively going after these things that help keep the deal alive and would give Iran further leverage to argue that it can roll back some of its commitments. And the last part of this, I would say, is, and Ari alluded to this as well, is do what we can to help our allies monitor implementation of the deal, right? It's in nobody's interest that Iran figures out a way to secretly cheat, so let's continue to provide that information, to work with our partners, to share that intelligence, and to, when instances do arise where there's an activity that fits in that gray space of potential noncompliance, let's, to the degree that it's not it's not drastically shortening timelines, or it's not, really reducing our influence, let's encourage resolution of those disputes through the mechanisms established within the JCPOA, even though we're not a part of that anymore. So the second recommendation we have in this category is to, plan for scenarios where Iran starts to roll back its commitments. And as part of that, I think what we really have to do is a couple of things. One, figure out really what nuclear activities are the most concerning for us, what means we really want to apply at our disposal, and I would argue we need to make this a combination of diplomatic, economic, and potentially military options to try and deter these activities, and also finally figure out how we want to communicate all of this to Iran. We might get into this a little bit later, but this is obviously what many would consider prudent strategic planning. We've done this before, but I think, it's been a while probably since we've walked through some of these drills. And, now that the United States is not in the deal anymore, now that we do have a risk of some of these aspects of the deal coming off, I think we really need to walk through this exercise again, because if and when something happens, it might not necessarily be immediately clear what we should do. It might not necessarily be immediately clear what the implications of those activities are. And so I really think it behooves us to have a plan in place to tackle those and react prudently rather than overreact. And so what does this look like conceptually? One, I think what we need to do is shift from what I think the administration has taken to date, which is sort of this policy of coercion, of trying to coerce Iran to get into a bigger and better deal, and what I would call a massive retaliation approach, right? So the going-in proposition has kind of been, don't even think of restarting your nuclear program or else, and shift to what I would call more of a deterrence approach and a flexible response, whereby we develop these retaliatory or responsive options actions that are scaled to deter certain Iranian activities that we care about. So I think that's kind of the conceptual shift that needs to happen. And I think, there's no easy answer to any of this, right? I mean, there's no real easy response to what these red lines should be or these sort of pink lines should be. But I think some of the things that we collectively came up with here that we really need to watch for are prioritizing deterring Iranian actions that either significantly or quickly reduce breakout timelines, efforts that reduce IAEA access, or that could improve pathways to weapons production, and here I would put sort of a plutonium reprocessing capability. One of the red lines that we throw out that we think the U.S. should strongly consider is any reduction in IAEA access below Iran's existing safeguards agreement, right? So in other words, the framework that's in place that's guided a lot of this for a long time, that existed pre-JCPOA and pre-JPOA, that is something that would really reduce international insight into Iran's program, that we really need to consider how we would respond to that. And so finally, this last part, this sort of unicorns and rainbows part, right, where we sort of think about what if we are in the scenario where we're able to get a bigger and better deal, whether under this administration or a future one. I think we need to recognize that the United States isn't going to get everything it wants, right? And I know it's sort of common sense, but I think we need to talk about that. And I think we need to realize that of those 12 demands, we're not going to get progress on all of them. We're not going to get perhaps full progress on any of them. And so I think the administration needs to think long and hard about what it's willing to focus on. And for those who would laugh that off and say, there's no way the administration is going to compromise on any of this, I would just point you to North Korea, right? Where, for better or worse, and we can talk about the current policies on that, the president has demonstrated that he is flexible, actually, in what he's willing to do. So I don't think it's really out of the realm of possible here. Within that framework, I would say what we really need to focus on, rather than lengthening breakout timelines, which again is sort of always going to be a temporary construct, and there's only so long you can get them for various technical reasons, focus on improving transparency measures and safeguards and ensuring that robust access that's going to both warn of a breakout, but also warn, which I think is more likely down the road, if we're going to sort of talk about nuclear weapon scenarios, which is a sneak out, a covert program. So I think that's really where we should focus our energies as part of that final step, should we be in that position.
Cool, and that's actually a nice transition to Ari, who I wanted you to talk a little bit about some of the recommendations we had in regards to how we engage with Iran. Something the administration hasn't done much of, though it has tried and failed, and it seems like maybe the question is whether there's any willingness on the Iranian side right now to do anything like that. So I don't know, what are your thoughts on that? And if you were the Trump administration, how would you think about engaging with the Iranians right now?
Yeah, so one of the recommendations was actually mentioned already. Nick brought it up, and I think Eric alluded to it as well, which is to actually leverage third parties. And I think the obvious third party for the longest time was Oman, which has a really great relationship with Iran. It has a good relationship with the United States. So, typically we've gone to Oman to sort of facilitate negotiations and engagement when we didn't want the talks to be sort of, publicized and for everyone to know, and for all the spoilers on every side to kind of come in and try to derail the situation. That's how the JCPOA negotiations started, for example. The problem with the Oman channel, though, is that it has the name JCPOA all over it at this point, so the Trump administration may not be as eager to use that. On the other hand, it has a really good relationship, or it is trying to have a really good relationship with Russia, and Russia is the only player right now in the Middle East that has access to every relevant actor and that can actually help de-escalate situation. It has a channel of communication with the U.S., it does with Israel, and it does with Iran, of course. So if you're worried about what's going on in Syria between Iran and Israel, as we are, then I think that being able to actually leverage the Russians in this situation is pretty useful. But overall, the big recommendation here is to have some sort of off-ramp, because I think we're all very concerned about escalation, about miscalculation, more so than anything else. And so you need to be able to have a way to de-escalate tensions, and the only way to do that is really through dialogue. There is no other way. And for the reasons that Ilan, you mentioned, right now, overt dialogue between the U.S. and Iran is tough, especially in Iran. Every time Rouhani has brought up the idea of having further negotiations about the missile program, for example, which is a sticking point for the Europeans as well. Hardliners have put a hard stop and said, we're not going to negotiate any further. We've already done that. We tried with the JCPOA. It didn't work. What is the point of negotiating again? So having broad daylight talks, like we saw during the JCPOA talks, is going to be difficult. And so you need a way to kind of have a third party to facilitate that and to have unofficial, I guess, channels that allow you to achieve these goals. But the more general, I guess, recommendation we're making is to actually clarify, for the administration to clarify its objectives. That's something that I think is anybody who's watching Iran right now, who's been watching the administration's strategy toward Iran evolve over the past few months, has been struggling with. What is the administration trying to do? I don't think many of us here have the answer to that. And so if you're sitting in Tehran and you're trying to make a decision about what to do next, then you're going to be very confused, right? And the problem is that different factions with different interests are going to pick up the pick and choose the elements of the narrative that are coming out of Washington, and they're holding on to that as signs of the U.S. not being a trustworthy party. I'll give you one example. When President Trump withdrew from the JCPOA, and the Iranians were, as they are, still trying to negotiate with the Europeans, bless you, the hardliners started to say that there was no point in continuing the conversation because of President Trump's rhetoric, because of various administration officials' sort of ties to the MEK, and so for them it was clear that the goal for the administration was regime change. I'm not sure that that's necessarily the case, but again, all the signs seem to point to the fact that the administration is not really that interested in having sort of a negotiated outcome, and so if you're a hardliner in Iran, you're going to pick and choose the regime change type elements of the narrative that is coming out of Washington. So clarifying the objective is really important. And one more thing is that I think a number of administration officials would point to the fact that the administration is looking for the big approach that Eric was describing. But again, it's not clear what the components of this big approach are. What is the U.S. willing to give to Iran in exchange for the 12 points that have been laid out by Secretary Pompeo? Well, if you're Iranian and you're trying to figure out whether or not this is worth it, whether or not the incentives that are presented are worth pursuing, then you're not going to be eager to come back to the table. Moreover, if you lay out very clearly what the intent is, what the objectives are, what is on the table, you raise the cost domestically for the regime not to return to the table. Again, the protests are not going to lead to the collapse of the regime tomorrow, but they are significant. They need to be taken into account. And you can do that by saying that, to the Iranian people, here's what we're willing to offer if your leaders come back to the negotiating table. And that, again, has not been done in a clear way. Finally, I think it's pretty obvious, but sort of laying out that regime change is not the administration's policy is, again, very important, because if you're sitting in Tehran, you're not sure that that's not the case. You do have different figures within different officials within the administration who say different things. Various people who are close to President Trump have various levels of ties with the MEK. That again signals to the Iranians that, and not just to the regime, but to the public more broadly, that the administration is looking for alternative options to the regime. So clarifying all of that and signaling it to the Iranians, to the public, and to the regime is all recommendations that we're making.
Yeah, and if I were to put a fine point on it, I would say at this point, given the sort of different messaging that comes through, I mean, at least in my view, it's got to be the president who comes out and very clearly says, it's not about regime change, and we're willing to put everything on the table in a broad negotiation, which would even probably include, and you've heard some in the administration say this, would include not just the secondary sanctions, but the direct U.S. sanctions to open up the U.S.-Iran trade relationship. So even if they continue to take this super hard line and do the maximum pressure to at least clarify what the other option is for the Iranians, and it would seem to me that the president sort of wants the big for big deal, as was pretty clear by North Korea, so I'm not sure this would be completely antithetical to what he wants to do. So maybe he needs to do that and overrule some of his advisors and other voices who are laying out some very different positions. So, Liz, moving on to you. In terms of sanctions and how we utilize economic pressure, but also how we don't inadvertently through this process weaken these tools that we use more broadly, for U.S. policy, not just on Iran, but on so many of the other issues you focus on, North Korea, Russia, elsewhere. What should the administration be doing next in terms of how it utilizes these economic tools?
I want to start by affirming the point you just made, which I don't want this to be lost on anyone because it is so significant. And that is that, like it or not, the U.S. does not have the luxury of focusing just with its economic tools just on Iran policy right now. It won't work in anything in the medium and longer term to just consider economic coercion tactics, these various options that you've mentioned, and I'll say a couple of others in a second, about how to use economic sanctions or other economic pressure strategies to advance U.S. policy and to try and influence the political space in which Iran can move. It won't work just to focus in the now. And so what Ilan was saying about there are tactics that may be used to address now timing concerns, but to the extent that the United States cannot afford, and this is true, the United States cannot afford to sabotage or diminish the leverage to use these measures in the longer term with respect to Iran or any other national security concern for which these tools are used, the administration and Congress has to concern itself with that bigger picture. So that has some pretty important implications about what's possible to do with economic measures. And this should be a good check in this era of maximum economic pressure against a whole array of U.S. national security concerns. We've heard about North Korea here, Venezuela as of 2 days ago, with this new maximum economic pressure strategy there. Lots of discussion about economic strategy with regard to Russia, et cetera, et cetera. The United States options on Iran here should be on the offensive measure, constrained to a couple of specific items. I'll talk about those in a second. And then there's some other more general ones about preserving this tool. Okay, so I have 5 quick points I'm going to make here. That's it. And then we'll move on, and I'd be happy to answer any further questions about these. But so 5 principles here for how to approach Iran policy, economic policy in the immediate term, being also sensitive to the need to not take actions that will diminish this tool for the longer-term Iran policy and other economic national security policies. First, the United States cannot and should not abandon this intensive pressure to use sanctions to identify dangerous, threatening Iranian actors in Iran or outside of Iran as proxies. This is the same play that we all know well, identifying IRGC, Quds Force, for example, operatives and networks, dangerous nodes and the missile procurement networks, terrorist actors and networks, including facilitators and individuals, and on and on. There's a variety of actions that can be taken there, and the U.S. administration gets an A for effort on working hard on this particular set of concerns. Moving on. Allies. So it has become, happily, received wisdom in this domain that sanctions are strongest when they are undertaken with allies. That is absolutely true. It doesn't mean that unilateral sanctions aren't strong, but particularly when you're talking about transnational networks for procurement or money flow or international proxies, for example, whether they operate in Europe or elsewhere in the Middle East, it's absolutely essential to have coordination with allies, and that can be possible in small and in large measure. It does not always mean that the EU must take parallel sanctions measures with the United States. There's a variety of other ways to do it, and they're not always at the level of sanctions. It could be other law enforcement or interdiction effort, but the principle here of coordination is essential. Third, the United States must be as clear as possible about the enforcement posture for its sanctions and the way to get off the sanctions list. So Ariane was talking about this just a moment ago. There are many virtues to stating what is already U.S. policy, what is already enshrined in law. There are clear indications in precedent and in statute about how to change the predicate that caused an entity to get on the sanctions list in the first place. And if they do that, they can be delisted. But you must say it out loud in order to send a political message that the United States is willing to take yes for an answer, which doesn't diminish U.S. policy. And it may go a long way to conditioning sensibilities in Iran that make it feasible to enter into a negotiation with the United States around this. And without that articulation, then who is to stop the people who claim that in Iran and elsewhere that the United States is only interested in regime change? So it must be the case that a path towards delisting is discussed. And also, this administration has shown that it is willing to make very big political delistings. If you saw Sunday the Deripaska companies that were just delisted, that is an enormous political undertaking by this administration, demonstrating a commitment to delisting generally and flexibility around how to do that. That's a lesson everyone should learn. Fourth, smart implementation. So in the way that enforcement occurs and the implementation of sanctions is carried out, there has to be a sensitivity to the danger of pushing foreign entities, financial entities in particular, to establish barter or payments mechanisms that avoid U.S. jurisdiction, which is to say creating sanctions-resistant currency areas or payment channels that the United States cannot get at, kind of a coalition of the sanctioned. Now, the SPV is not that yet. I don't believe it will be. No one I know really believes that it would grow into that. The danger is that if this is a beta test, and what happens if the United States continues to give more and more ammunition or incentive to foreign economic actors to try and establish and institutionalize those mechanisms, particularly if we're talking about some of the biggest economies of the world or the ones with the greatest liquidity. And actually that is happening, where you have European central banks talking to China and thinking about whether there is some there they can pursue. That is very dangerous. And what that means is that the United States must be cautious in how it chooses to enforce its sanctions in order to not unnecessarily provoke that. And one way to do that could be for the United States to lean further forward on humanitarian trade for Iran and not give that easy win to other countries who want to create a sanctions-resistant payment channel to do what is already allowed in U.S. law, humanitarian trade. Lastly, it is essential that the United States be mindful not to spike oil prices by forcing the Iranian oil exports to zero too fast. So particularly as of 2 days ago, now that the United States has imposed these massive barriers on the export of Venezuelan, or rather on the Venezuelan National Oil Company, which will have an impact for Venezuela's oil production and flows. This is a very large global producer of a medium heavier grade crude like Iran, which creates extra pressure for all of you energy wonks in the audience, creates extra pressure on that grade of crude in the global market. So, and if we have also consideration of what perhaps may be done further with respect to Russian energy sanctions, we're in very sensitive territory here with regard to U.S. policy influencing global oil markets. So recall that a misstep here enriches Iran with more generous prices. You can sell less and earn as much, maybe more, depending on where the prices go. That is not the point, obviously. Also, we as U.S. consumers and the voting constituency in the United States is sensitive to oil prices and gasoline prices. It is really important to be careful about not making that the issue that we understand Iran around and instead stay focused on these other policy concerns that we're discussing right now.
Cool. So I'm going to go to Nick in a second and ask him about the regional questions issues and what the recommendations are there. Before I do, just to tell everybody here, this will be my last question, and then I'm going to open it up to the audience for Q&A. So get your questions ready and be prepared. And so Nick, here, fine, I'll give you an easy question. How do we solve Syria and Yemen? No, what do we do? What do we do to try to push back Iran in Syria, Yemen? And
So one of the recommendations that we made, I'll start with Syria. The idea of keeping a U.S. presence in Syria was predicated on trying to apply pressure not on Iran but on Russia, right? And fundamentally, this goes to a point that Ariane made earlier, is that the situation is so far gone now in Syria that you have to be realistic about what you're going for. I'll give a quick anecdote. I was in Jordan in October, and I was talking to various different Syrian opposition there. And they gave me a story which I thought was indicative of where we are now. One senior Trump administration official dealing with Syria comes in and tells the Jordanians, we want Iran out of Syria. And they're like, oh, you mean it's proxies? They're like, no, all of Iran out of Syria. And the Jordanians were kind of freaked out by that. Like, what do you mean? Is there going to be a conflict? Next week, another senior administration official dealing with Syria comes in. Clarified, no, we just mean Iran-backed forces. So this, I think, is indicative of the administration needs to define what it is that it exactly wants to do with Iran vis-a-vis Syria. Does it want to remove Iran's military infrastructure that's built since 2011? Does it want the withdrawal of all Iranian-backed proxy forces? Does it want fundamental changes in the Assad government and its security forces, because it views Assad essentially as a carrier of the IRGC strain in the Levant? And so I think this is important. The United States needs to use all the leverage that it has available to it in Syria to get to this. So once it's set out a goal, if the goal is no, we understand Iran will continue to have influence in Syria because it had influence prior to the civil war. What we want to do is we want to sort of scale back what it has. We want to remove its military infrastructure that threatens Israel. We want to get rid of the IRGC-backed proxies. The U.S. needs to use its leverage to get actors like Russia, but also other actors such as the Arab states that have now begun to engage with Damascus to get to that. And that may require maintaining a U.S. presence, in quotation marks, in northern eastern Syria and increasing the various sanctions measures on the Assad government as a way to undercut Russia's position and bring it closer to our position. In Yemen, the challenge is that until the Houthi movement has been fundamentally changed in its military capabilities, Saudi Arabia is not going to be comfortable. As we mentioned in the report, however, Saudi Arabia has conducted its air campaign in a way that's led to massive human suffering, and that's a problem. And so I do believe that the administration does have a unique ability to engage with the Saudis to find a way to change Saudi threat perception, and they should go to the Houthis and say, here's what we want. We want you off of the border, and we want you to withdraw military forces from Sana'a. And maybe that's a deal that can be made. The challenge in Yemen is that until the Houthis feel there's incentives for the Houthis to do that, you're going to continue to have a conflict.
Yeah, I mean, and the other thing we do get into in the report, especially on Yemen, is also to say that, this idea that we should necessarily pull all support for Saudi Arabia is not necessarily, might make us feel good, but it's not necessarily going to get them to change their behavior. But on the other hand, we need to offer them a choice. Either fundamentally change your approach on some of these questions or lose American support for the conflict in Yemen. So as opposed to walking away tomorrow or saying, let's pull all of our arms sales to Saudi, saying to them, guys, you have a choice. Either we work on this together and how we actually solve this conflict, and you change the way. Part of that is you changing the way you're conducting this campaign. And also, by the way, no more crazy surprises and no more problematic things like Khashoggi, like Lebanon and Hariri and some of these other steps. And if you're not willing to do that, then we are going to pull out. And we are going to pull our support for you, and you're on your own to figure this out. But maybe trying to use that leverage in the best way you can. And this would be an area where I would argue the administration had had huge leverage in the aftermath of the Khashoggi affair and chose not to use it, and actually did the opposite by continuing to give the Saudis a green light on everything. So, I think that I view that at least as a missed opportunity, and Nick and I have had a lot of conversations about that, as well as this idea on Syria of whether we can get the Russians to sort of partially change their behavior, since their interests are fundamentally different than the Iranian interests. The Russians are looking to consolidate victory and pull out, or the Iranians in some ways are still in this escalatory game, and that creates some separation. Can you use that? Maybe. Anyway, sorry, just me stepping a little bit beyond the moderator and opining on a couple of things I wanted to get into as well. But with that, I think what we should do is open it up for questions from the audience. So if you have a question, raise your hand. I will call on you. Please, these are questions, not statements. Keep them concise, short, with a question mark at the end. So, right here in the front row. I think there's, by the way, I said there's a microphone coming.
Roy Gutman. Question, I think, for Nick. What impact has Trump's announcement had on Iranian force displacement and the position of the various militias in Syria? This is only 6 weeks later, but still, maybe you can see them. For example, has the corridor developed beyond the theoretical stage? Is there one corridor? Are there multiple corridors? And what about Tanif? I still don't know the fate of Tanif. Is it going to stay? And what will happen? What will it do for Iran if it is removed? I might make one quick observation, if I can just break your rule for a second.
Those are good questions.
Which is that in September, that the sanctions may have worked in a way that nobody expected. In September, when the regime was trying to go into Idlib and planning to go in, didn't have its own ground forces. It needed the Iranian militias, basically, to go in as its forces. They didn't. The Turks supposedly used the sanctions as a threat to Iran. They demanded that you not send in the militias, otherwise Turkey would not play along with getting around the sanctions. So the sanctions may have had an unforeseen spin-off and a positive one in Syria for that moment.
Well, thank you. Those are outstanding questions. I'll start with Tanif. I have always been skeptical of the effect to which Tanif actually constrains the Iranians. I know that there has been some thought that it allows us to provide surveillance on their so-called land bridge. I've publicly been skeptical of this idea of a land bridge. The Iranians can fly what they need into Damascus International Airport, and now they've built, again, a military infrastructure in the Syrian Lebanese border region that allows them to be able not to be constrained by land bridge. So I think Tanif, if we're maintaining Tanif just for a counter-Iran reason, it's not really a good reason to have Tanif anymore. And it's far better to, if you're going to maintain Tanif, you're better off maintaining control over 1/3 of Syria, including its best water resources, oil resources, arable lands, and electricity producing resources. So if the trade-off is 1/3 of Syria to keep Tanif, it's a bad trade-off. In regard to how the IRGC has mobilized forces, there's two major lines of effort that we've observed over the last 6 weeks. One is that they've moved some branches of IRGC-tied Iraqi Hashd Shabi groups further down on the Assad government-controlled side of the Euphrates River. They've positioned those forces, groups like Kataib Hezbollah, for example, towards the border point in Abu Kamal. So they've increased the number of Shia militias there. They've also tried to recruit more local Syrians. So this is part of the dynamic with Iran and Syria. It has multiple lines of influence. It has the IRGC-backed forward militias, but it also has Syrian organizations that are local Syrians that it has developed lines of influence and efforts with. And that's primarily through the 4th Intelligence Division.
Other questions? Over here on the right.
Hi, my name is Mason Fulling. A question for Liz. How effective do you think the snapback sanctions from November 5th have been? And to what extent do you see the SPV out of Europe undermining that effort and U.S. sanctions in general?
Thank you for those questions. I don't remember if I don't write it down, but I'm good now. How effective are these sanctions? I spoke to this a little bit before, but to put a finer point on it, these sanctions have been, let's call them, quite effective at creating economic outcomes that the United States intended. And that means forcing foreign banks to get out of the business of doing transactions for Iranian customers or with Iranian entities, even in an attenuated way through nested correspondent accounts. Furthermore, there has been quite good adherence to the oil restrictions, which have compelled everyone except for 8 countries to get out of the business of purchasing Iranian oil. Now, we don't know exactly the quotas that are permitted to the countries purchasing Iranian oil because this administration hasn't disclosed much publicly and hasn't spoken publicly about the percent reductions that are required for each of the different 8 countries that are permitted to import oil and at what level they will, those quotas will decrease each 180-day period. That's something that in the last administration there was more public discussion about, and consistency in percentage terms. Roughly across each of the countries, there were 6 in that instance during the last administration that we were focused on that had those significant reduction exemptions. But there had been quite a lot of anxiety in the global marketplace about these oil reductions since early July, that this administration was going to force purchases of Iranian oil to go to zero, a zero tolerance policy, which would have had quite significant market impacts. It did when the United States government first said we will go to zero tolerance. There was a spike in the market on that day and for the next couple of days, which should be a lesson about cautiousness in signaling the market by this government about any oil-related sanction and being absolutely clear what is intended by such an announcement. But though the administration walked back from that a bit and then obviously gave out these permissions to reduce at a slower rate, there's still been quite strong compliance. And perhaps the most surprising element has been Chinese compliance with these measures. There's always an expectation that there had been previously, and so there is now. So that expectation was pulled forward into this instance and applied here. As it turns out, not entirely appropriately so, that China would be a backfiller for everyone else who's been getting out of the Iranian trading and financial activity business. And in fact, that has not been the case. So I mentioned previously that Chinese exports to Iran have been declining. In the fourth quarter of last year, they were down in a noticeable way, which is challenging for Iran economically. And why is this? Well, it could be that we can make a couple of good guesses here, but it could be that China has bigger fish to fry with the United States and the U.S.-China bilateral economic relationship related to trade issues, related to North Korea. And this Iran matter is not so significant. Let us not forget ZTE and Huawei as primary issues of today, in fact, that the United States and China will deal with. So Iran really moves way down the priority ladder, which is a good reason for China not to use up its political capital or its economic leverage by leaning in too hard with transacting with with Iran. So that is an instance of greater effect of these unilateral so-called snapback sanctions than people may have anticipated for reasons unrelated to Iran. The SPV, I will just reiterate that I don't expect that it will be useful in practice for more than humanitarian transactions at best, but I strongly discourage discounting it in consideration if it won't succeed in this first instance, because it may be an example, as I mentioned before, a beta test for what further initiatives could come, and possibly not in the Iran context, maybe in the Russia context, for example. It may be that European countries are more interested in and much more motivated to create a second generation SPV with regard to financial transactions with Russia in order to sustain them in the face of of potential new U.S. sanctions that would come down hard on European companies that do business with Russia, who, when faced with the choice of whether to do business with Russia or the United States, will not choose the United States. So to your last question, the significance for the broader sanctions regime, that is a very real concern that sanctions observers and the policy community must concern themselves with.
So, additional questions over here.
I had two questions. One, I'm James Rock.
So why don't we wait for the microphone?
Yeah. I had two quick questions. One for Ari, and I'm maybe totally out of the loop, but I assume you read newspapers and things in Farsi. So, how important is this nuclear deal to Iranians? I mean, are they that concerned with it? And because there's many reasons for these demonstrations, right? It's related to water prices, and then I've also heard that there are people upset about the money that's going to support militias in other countries. I mean, could you talk to that? And then Nick, realistically, what sort of pressure can the United States put on Saudi Arabia to stop the war? I mean, there are those bills, and I think one is being discussed today in Congress to stop U.S. support in whatever capacity logistically. You know, is that, even if that bill were to pass, which it doesn't look like it will because the president could veto it, would that help in any way to stop the war?
So Ari, why don't we turn to you first?
Yeah, thanks for that. So I think you're exactly right to note that the JCPOA is not a driver behind the protest, right? I mean, the JCPOA is not the end of what Iran is pursuing. It is the means toward economic reform. So the way the Rouhani government sold the JCPOA at home was not to say, we're getting a nuclear deal because we want to put limits on our nuclear program. The way they sold it was that this was the key that was going to unlock the sanctions, and that was going to therefore lead to economic recovery, which the country needed badly. The main drivers behind the protests are mainly mismanagement, corruption, lack of opportunities, unemployment, and all of these are related to the economy, right? So the economy is really the biggest driver there. All the other drivers are kind of secondary. So things like the opposition to Iranian policies in the region are secondary. They've sort of manifested themselves throughout the protests, but they're not the reason why people are coming out to the streets. They're not coming out to protest the Syrian policies pursued by the regime. They're there to talk about the real issues that affect them, which are access to medication, access to jobs, and so the way the reformists and Rouhani, the centrists, sort of generally have framed the issue is that if the JCPOA succeeds, if the Europeans manage to make the SPV work, if they manage to give Iran the economic benefits and the sanctions relief that it's been wanting, then they will be able to actually improve the economy. And they try to do that, or Rouhani's point anyway has been that they have to do that while at the same time pursuing domestic reforms economically, including fighting corruption, including fighting the role of the IRGC in various industries and key sectors of the economy. So the JCPOA is very closely tied to economic recovery. It's not necessarily that people are out protesting the fact that the JCPOA is there or that there are limits on the Arak heavy water reactor. That is just part of what the hardliners have instrumentalized in their pushback and their criticism of the Rouhani government.
Nick?
This is an excellent question because fundamentally what we're discussing here is Saudi Arabia's sense of its own national security. Saudi Arabia has engaged in conflicts in the past in northern Yemen, some of which were against the Houthi movement. It has had a long and abiding interest in northern Yemen. Perhaps my viewpoint is different from others, but I don't view U.S. legislation necessarily as what will get the Saudis to stop this war. I think fundamentally it's about the Saudis feeling that the Houthi movement is, one, no longer going to be able to control, or at least have fire control over hundreds of kilometers of southwest Saudi Arabia. 2, won't use missiles that it would fire in Saudi Arabia. And 3, doesn't become, and you see this from the Saudis, the language they use doesn't become a Yemeni Hezbollah or Hashad. They use the Hashad movement as well. And this is the challenge, is that when we talk about the Houthi, and now their ties to Iran, but fundamentally, for Saudi Arabia, it does, in a sense, it is a strict matter of national security. So from a U.S. perspective, the idea would be, is there a way that we can offer them tangible support regarding that war that they have against the Houthis in a constrained and managed way that shows that the Saudis are actually, in a sense, the adult in the room, that the Saudis try to use multilateral efforts to find a pathway out of the conflict, that they provide deals that they could cut with the Houthis that would bring the Houthis off the border and reduce the Houthi military control over Sana'a, which is also a red line for the Saudis. The challenge is all that I've described actually means the U.S. would become more engaged in the war in northern Yemen, not less engaged, but it would have to do so in a steady and in a reserved manner. In a sense, what you're trying to do is get Saudi Arabia's security concerns to be alleviated, and at that point, you may be able to have a pathway forward.
And I would just, on the Saudi point, since Nick and I have slightly different views on this and go back and forth, I mean, my view is the one point the U.S. leverage that we really do have is not the weapons sales. It's actually the fundamental strategic relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia and U.S. security guarantees to Saudi Arabia. So I would argue I agree that we can support the Saudis, as Nick described, but only if we see change in behavior from them. And so I would offer, rather than saying we're going to cut arms or try to pass legislation to cut arms sales, I would actually give them a choice. I would say, we need to see a change of behavior on Yemen. You need to figure out this Qatar mess you've created, and we need a promise from you for no more surprises. And if you're going to offer those, we're in with you. And if you're not going to offer those, then we're going to fundamentally change the way we deal with you. We're not going to end the relationship. You're too important for that. But we might need to rely more on others than we do on you, the UAE, Qatar, other countries in the region, because we're not going to have that deep strategic relationship we've had in the past. It's not helping us anymore. And that would, I don't know if that would work, but I think it would catch their attention a lot more than congressional legislation to stop selling bombs that the Saudis don't believe is a favor we're doing to them, because they're spending billions of dollars on this and infusing it into our economy. So they don't see this as some huge gift that we're giving them. And so that was just one thing I would argue, at least on the Saudi area. So anyway, sorry, that's me again, hopping in as the moderator and expressing some of my views. But do we have additional questions? And maybe what we might do is take maybe 3 or 4 questions or any outstanding questions and do one final round through the panel. So anybody with...
I would just follow up.
Well, why don't I take a question in the back, and then also if you want to follow up with, we'll let you get the microphone and also do that.
This is a question for Liz. She mentioned about the importance about creating transparency and then leveraging third parties. You talked about Russia. If you were to choose another 1 or 2 countries, which would they be that you would try to leverage and our partnership with, and why?
I think we had a follow-up up here. Any other questions in the audience? We had a follow-up over here.
I guess a follow-up to the Saudi question would be, how important is Iran's role in supporting the Houthis? Because we've been, as journalists, we're every couple of months and happily so taken to a military base in Washington where they show us these arms that are supplied back. So if Iran were not involved, would the Houthis be dead? I mean, would they, as a force?
And then maybe what I'll do is I'll add one final question thrown to the mix and just go through the panel one more time, which is to say we've spent this last hour and a half talking about where we are right now and what to do with no JCPOA. But is there any prospect in, let's say, early 2021, if Iran has continued to abide by the deal for the next year and a half and a new administration comes in, that the U.S. should go back into the agreement or can go back into the agreement, or how would it do that? How are we thinking sort of about that? So I think those are the three questions. What partners are there other partners we should be working through? It can be for Liz, but it can also be for anybody on the panel. Iran's role and support for the Houthis, and then is there possible to go back into the JCPOA in 2021? Eric, maybe I'll start with you and then just sort of go down the panel. And anything else that you guys want to throw into the mix on any of those questions?
So start off with the one you said. Okay.
Just answer whatever you want.
Whatever I'd like to say.
Whatever you would like to say. Your final shot.
Okay, sure. I'll dive into the question that you threw out there about whether or not in 2021, if there's a new administration, should the United States go back into the JCPOA, and how should it do so? I think the answer to should it go back, if it can do so, is yes. I do think that I think one, that it should. I think two, there would be an opportunity to do so. The question for me is, I would argue that as much as we might disagree with the decision to withdraw from the deal to begin with, I think it's the U.S. as a result of that, and as a result of Iran staying in the deal, the U.S. now has leverage, I would argue. And so the question is, when we go back into the deal, how do we use that leverage, and how do we try and shape that conversation, and what do we want to achieve for our objectives, while balancing sort of not tanking the prospects of returning to that deal? And I think, as was alluded to earlier, yes, Iran has remained committed to the JCPOA and it's stayed in, but I'm not comfortable that that's going to continue indefinitely, right? I mean, I think Iran is waiting to see what more can get from the Europeans, what kind of how hard sanctions are going to bite, what happens in the 2020 election in the U.S. So I think these are all things that it's waiting to evaluate, and it's constantly reevaluating. I don't think there's been some sort of decision that we will stay in the deal no matter what. So I think it's imperative that we not operate indefinitely with that level of uncertainty, because I don't think it's going to continue to exist indefinitely. So the question is, how do we convert this leverage that we do have?
All right.
So I'll start with the question about who else we can leverage, and the obvious ones. And Ilan, you mentioned the Gulf Arabs. I think that's a good place to start. Kuwait, Qatar are good places to start. Obviously the Europeans, but I think one partner that we don't really think about as much in U.S.-Iran relations is actually India. India has quite a lot at stake in terms of India wants to have a decent trade relationship with Iran. That's not necessarily been the case, because it is a good U.S. partner, and so it tries to be as compliant with sanctions as possible. I'll defer to Liz on this one. But India has been involved in the building of the Chabahar port in southeastern Iran, which is critical for Afghanistan, actually. And so they've been receiving some exemptions from the U.S. for that work. So India could be a good partner to leverage. They have decent ties with Iran, and of course they have good relations with the U.S. In terms of your question, Ilan, I'll build on what Eric was talking about. I think one sort of big question to ask ourselves is whether we're talking about 2021 or 2027. I think those will be fundamentally different situations, because as Eric was saying, if you're in Tehran right now, you're sitting there and watching what happens over the next few couple of years. You're trying to see if there is a second Trump term, and if there is, then your calculation is going to be very different from the scenario where you have either a Democrat or a different Republican take office in 2021. So that's one. The second thing is that in 2020, let's not forget, Iran has parliamentary elections. What happens in the lead to parliamentary elections in Iran is typically brutal. You have a lot of infighting that manifests itself with things that we don't like, activities like missile launches and the IRGC kind of poking the U.S. Navy in the eye in the Persian Gulf. So you tend to have hardliners trying to assert themselves, and given Rouhani's performance so far, it's fair to assume that you're going to have a lot of pressure on the reformists and the moderates to deliver something and to get more concessions, not just from the EU, but potentially from the U.S. if the U.S. decides to go back to the negotiating table or to re-enter the JCPOA in 2021. So the question, should the U.S. Go back or try to re-enter the JCPOA in 2021? I think the answer depends on the concessions that Iran would want to leverage from the situation.
Liz?
I'm going to pick up on your question here and just add a thought or two. To state the obvious, but let it not go unstated. It's going to be, and coming at this from the part of the concessions that the United States would presumably need to make in order to re-enter into this deal, concessions to Iran and the realm of sanctions relief. It is hard to roll back and unravel sanctions, and I think it is only something the United States could accomplish with respect to rejoining a deal if there is highest level administration sustained support for this goal, because there will be lots of people on the Hill, even Democrats, where inclined towards the pragmatism of nuclear arms control and continuing to do everything possible to keep Iran in a posture of intensive inspections and verifications and limiting its enrichment activities. But they will want to kick the administration in the face when they come back, whoever that is, this one or the next one, after the next generals, if they are committed to trying to re-enter the nuclear agreement with Iran. And so what we must see is that sustained commitment from the administration to overcome this anti-Iran ideology, and the fact that this Trump administration has reimposed many of those Iran sanctions, not only pursuant to the non-proliferation authorities, but also pursuant to terrorism authorities. So delisting some of those entities means telling Iran it is now off the hook without having changed its behavior on terrorism. That is a huge issue to get over. There is precedent for that in the United States, like it or not, with regard to sanctions, but that's another big hurdle to get over. And it may be that the nuclear threat landscape necessitates taking some of those hard positions at that time, but my view is that at status quo, we don't yet have, and we can't, it's hard to foresee that kind of intensive political motivation being able to triumph here towards a re-entry, though if we see the kind of catalysts resulting from real concerns about Iran beginning to break out, but nevertheless being willing to stay in a deal if there's U.S. support, we'd have to see some of those kind of flags or indicators in order for this scenario to be possible. I'll just stop there for now.
So Nick, we'll give you the final word.
So the Houthis existed as an effective social, political, and military movement prior to the more active engagement of the IRGC Quds Force over the course of the Civil War. And there's been several decades of sort of romancing from the Quds Force, particularly on the level of cultural and social exchange, to try to shape the Houthi movement in a certain way. But fundamentally, the Zaidi Imamate has a lot of differences with the idea of Walayat al-Faqih that the Quds Force is trying to spread throughout the world. I think ideally for the Iranians, they would want the Houthis to be an ally, not a proxy, so a partner, not a proxy, and to provide a permissive terrain for the Iranians to apply strategic pressure on Saudi Arabia. Over the course of that civil war, over the course of the most recent one, where we've seen the biggest impact of the IRGC Quds Force hasn't necessarily been in the missiles, it's been in the small unit tactics that the Houthis use. And they have benefited from trainers that have been provided by that broader Hezbollah network. And I think in that way, that engagement between the two sides has been beneficial. The Quds Force has made the Houthis more effective in certain ways, beyond just mountain combat, but in other environments. And the Houthis provide the Quds Force with the actual real estate that they need to make Saudi Arabia feel the pain.
Well, on that note, I want to thank you all for joining us and for braving the elements this morning that fortunately weren't as bad as we thought they might be. I encourage you to grab a copy of the report if you have it on the way out, and the nifty little, for those who don't want to read the full 40 pages, the nifty 2-pager is always useful. And just take a moment to thank our panelists. I thought it was a really great conversation.
Thank you.